Hollywood told us gunfights were clean until Italy ripped the bandage off. One legendary duel bankrupted its studio, waiting for perfect sunlight. Another used 90,000 blank rounds in a single scene. Actors suffered real injuries for authenticity. These 21 standoffs didn't just entertain, they rewrote cinema's DNA. Every modern action scene owes them a blood debt. The good, the bad, and the ugly. 1966. Sergio Leone's three-way standoff completely reinvented what a Western duel could be. Three men, a graveyard, and buried gold. Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach circle each other for nearly 5 minutes of pure tension before a single shot is fired. The camera gets uncomfortably close to their squinting eyes, sweaty hands, and trigger fingers. Leone transformed what should have been a simple shootout into cinema's most legendary Mexican standoff, a triangle of death where no one can make the first move without risking everything. Leone shot this scene by repeatedly cycling through extreme close-ups of each actor's eyes, creating an almost unbearable tension. The sequence took 3 days to film in the blistering Spanish heat. Wallach later said he nearly passed out multiple times from dehydration while wearing that heavy coat. The iconic music from Ennio Morricone wasn't added until post-production, so the actors stood in silence for take after take, creating real anxiety you can see in their faces. Leone even fired real guns near the actors between takes to keep them on edge, making their flinches and tension authentic. When asked about the scene years later, Eastwood said, "Leone wanted us uncomfortable. He wanted that sweat real. He'd make us stand there in the sun for an hour before rolling camera." Critics initially dismissed it as excessive, but that final standoff has been endlessly studied in film schools. Martin Scorsese called it the greatest achievement in pacing I've ever seen. The duel cost around $200,000 to shoot, almost a quarter of the entire film's budget, and changed Western shootouts forever. Filmmakers from Tarantino to Nolan still reference it as the template for building tension without dialogue. That's why, after all these years, those grave markers, Arch Stanton, Unknown, and Tuco, remain the most famous cemetery plot in cinema history. For a few dollars more, 1965. Before the iconic cemetery standoff, Leone perfected the Western duel with the final confrontation between Colonel Mortimer and El Indio. Lee Van Cleef and Gian Maria Volonté circle a small town square as a musical pocket watch plays the only soundtrack. This wasn't just about who could draw faster, it was psychological warfare set to music. The pocket watch melody doesn't just mark time, it marks the shared trauma between these men, creating a duel where the past and present collide in a hail of bullets. Leone filmed this duel with a broken dolly, forcing his crew to push the camera by hand for those iconic tracking shots. They laid down wooden planks in the dirt to smooth the movement, creating the gliding effect that made Leone's style so distinctive. Van Cleef, a real-life marksman, insisted on using live ammo for the shooting scenes of stationary objects, terrifying the Italian crew. They had to convince him to stop before someone got killed. The production couldn't afford safety officers or proper stunt coordinators, making every gunshot genuinely dangerous. What sets this duel apart is the emotional weight. It's not just about who's faster, it's about vengeance for Mortimer's sister. When the truth is revealed through flashbacks, audiences in Milan reportedly gasped out loud. The sequence grossed $5 million in America alone, stunning United Artists who'd written off spaghetti westerns as cheap knockoffs. Film historian Alex Cox calls it the moment European cinema officially eclipsed Hollywood in the Western genre. Leone himself later admitted this was his favorite duel he ever filmed, more intimate and emotionally complex than the more famous standoff in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The musical pocket watch became so iconic that prop replicas still sell for hundreds of dollars to collectors wanting to own a piece of the tension Leone created in that dusty plaza. Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968. Charles Bronson's harmonica faces off against Henry Fonda's Frank in what might be cinema's most operatic duel. Leone opens with extreme widescreen vistas, then punches in so close you can count the pores on their faces. The final revelation that harmonica is avenging his brother's death comes through a flashback that still shocks viewers today. This isn't just a gunfight. It's the culmination of a lifetime of waiting, planned down to the last detail by a man who learned to play the harmonica just so his enemy would recognize him at the moment of death. Leone convinced Henry Fonda, America's beloved good guy for decades, to play one of cinema's coldest killers by simply saying, "Picture this. The camera shows a gunman from the waist down, pulling his gun and shooting a running child. The camera pans up to the gunman's face and it's Henry Fonda." Fonda immediately signed on, knowing this role would shatter his image forever. He even wore brown contacts to make his famous blue eyes colder and more menacing. The studio begged Leone to cast someone else, afraid Fonda's image would be permanently damaged. The duel took 7 days to shoot in Monument Valley. Leone insisted on filming at specific times of day to capture the exact quality of light he wanted. The production nearly went bankrupt, waiting for perfect sunsets. Each harmonica note was recorded separately and layered to create the haunting sound that announces Bronson's character. The crew built multiple versions of the set to accommodate different camera angles. But it paid off. Roger Ebert called it the greatest visual Western ever made. Despite bombing in America on release making just $2.1 million against a $5 million budget, it's now recognized as Leone's masterpiece. Leone himself said, "In my childhood mythology, the Western was America. Now, I have killed the Western. There can be no more Westerns like this one." The duel represents not just a clash between characters, but between Hollywood's sanitized Old West and the brutal reality Leone brought to the screen. The Wild Bunch, 1969. The final shootout in Peckinpah's ultra-violent classic isn't a traditional duel, but it changed everything about how gun violence was portrayed on screen. Pike Bishop's gang against the Mexican army, filmed with multiple cameras running at different speeds. The sequence features 325 separate edits in just 5 minutes, creating a bloody ballet that still feels shocking today. What begins as a rescue attempt transforms into a suicide mission. These aging outlaws choosing how they'll die in a world that no longer has a place for them. Peckinpah used 6 cameras simultaneously, some running at different speeds, to capture the carnage from multiple angles. Blood squibs were loaded with far more fake blood than had ever been used in Hollywood productions. The studio executives were horrified when they saw the dailies, demanding cuts. Peckinpah responded by adding more blood. The MPAA slapped an X rating on it, which Peckinpah wore as a badge of honor. He fought the studio for final cut, threatening to disown the film if they made changes without his approval. Warner Brothers almost shelved the film after early screenings caused walkouts. One executive reportedly vomited after watching the final cut. But critics recognized its brilliance. Pauline Kael called it the first American film that might be called great in the way that novels by Dostoevsky are great. The violence wasn't gratuitous, it was the point. This wasn't the sanitized West of earlier films, but a bloody, brutal world where death had consequences you could see on screen. William Holden later said, "What Sam did was show that when you shoot someone, they don't just grab their chest and fall over. They come apart." The final shootout cost nearly $100,000 to film in 1969 dollars, with over 90,000 blank rounds fired. The sequence's influence extended far beyond Westerns. Films like John Woo's The Killer, Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, and even The Matrix's lobby scene all draw directly from Peckinpah's revolutionary approach to filming violence. A Fistful of Dollars, 1964. The final showdown between the man with no name and Ramon fundamentally changed Western duels forever. Eastwood's poncho reveal, showing the metal plate that saved him from Ramon's bullet, still gets audiences cheering 50 years later. This duel introduced the world to a new kind of Western hero, one who wins through cunning rather than just speed. The man with no name doesn't just outdraw his opponent, he outsmarts him, turning Ramon's own confidence against him with a bulletproof vest hidden under that iconic poncho. Leone shot this on a shoestring budget in Spain with a crew that barely spoke English. The set was cobbled together from leftover materials, creating that distinctive weathered look by necessity rather than design. The duel itself was improvised when they ran out of money for the originally planned sequence. Eastwood's iconic line, "When a man with a rifle meets a man with a pistol, the man with the pistol is a dead man, unless that pistol is a .45, was actually written by Eastwood himself the night before shooting. The Production was so broke that Eastwood brought his own black jeans and serape from America because the costume department couldn't afford them. The film made $14.5 million on a $200,000 budget and launched three massive careers: Leone's, Eastwood's, and composer Ennio Morricone's. Japanese director Akira Kurosawa successfully sued for plagiarism, as the film unofficially adapted his samurai film Yojimbo. Despite this controversy, it remains the duel that launched the spaghetti western revolution. Leone didn't just reinvent the gunfight, he reinvented the gunfighter. American studios initially dismissed the film as a cheap Italian knockoff, but audiences worldwide responded to its gritty authenticity. John Wayne reportedly hated what Eastwood and Leone were doing to the Western genre, calling it degenerate. 5 decades later, it's clear that this small-budget duel between a laconic stranger and a Mexican bandit changed cinema more profoundly than most big-budget epics of the era. The Magnificent Seven, 1960. The final confrontation between Yul Brynner's Chris and Eli Wallach's Calvera isn't flashy by today's standards, but its emotional impact still resonates. When Calvera asks, "You came back? Why?" and Chris simply replies, "You forget something. We deal in lead, friend." Before firing, it created one of Western cinema's most quotable moments. This wasn't about trick shots or fancy camera work. It was about the shock of betrayal and the code of the gunfighter distilled into a single exchange and a single decisive shot. Director John Sturges filmed this sequence with a revolutionary zoom lens that was brand new technology in 1960. The ability to punch in on actors' faces without moving the camera completely changed how tension was built in Western standoffs. Brynner, a real-life sharpshooter, could actually hit targets at 100 yards and performed his own quick-draw scenes. He insisted on wearing all black despite the desert heat, passing out multiple times during filming. The costume became so iconic that Brynner would wear variations of it for the rest of his career. When asked why he came back to face near certain death, Brynner said of his character, "Chris couldn't live with himself if he didn't. Some men have principles that override their survival instinct." The film underperformed in America, but became a sensation in Europe, grossing over $9 million internationally. It directly inspired Leone to make his Dollars trilogy. Kurosawa, whose Seven Samurai was adapted for this film, attended a screening in Los Angeles and reportedly said, "I'm glad they stole from me. They made it their own." The film's success led to 3 sequels, none of which recaptured the original's impact. The confrontation between Chris and Calvera remains a masterclass in understatement, proving that sometimes the most effective duels aren't about who has the quickest draw, but who has the strongest conviction. When Brynner fires that final shot, he's not just killing a bandit, he's upholding a code that defined the mythic West, where a man's word was supposedly his bond. The Professionals, 1966. The 3-way standoff between Lee Marvin, Burt Lancaster, and Jack Palance climaxes with Palance's character making a crucial decision that subverts the typical Western duel expectations. Director Richard Brooks filmed this scene in Death Valley in 120-degree heat. The actors were passing out between takes. What makes this confrontation unique is that it's not just about shooting skills. It's about the moral code of mercenaries who discover their mission isn't what they thought. The real gunfight happens in the eyes and words exchanged before anyone reaches for a weapon. Brooks insisted on using long lenses to compress the desert space, making it appear as though the characters were trapped together despite standing far apart. This technique created a claustrophobic feeling in a wide-open landscape, a visual representation of the moral trap these men find themselves in. The guns fired real blanks loaded with double the normal powder to create bigger muzzle flashes, which nearly burned Lancaster's hand during one take. Lancaster, a former circus acrobat, performed his own stunts, including diving to avoid gunfire. Marvin, a decorated World War II Marine, brought military precision to his handling of weapons that impressed the professional armorers on set. The film grossed $8.8 million on a $3 million budget, but what's most interesting is how it influenced later films. Quentin Tarantino has cited this specific standoff as direct inspiration for the Mexican standoffs in his films. The dialogue, particularly Palance's line, "Honor died in the West a long time ago," has been sampled in everything from hip-hop tracks to video games. Brooks deliberately shot the standoff to undermine Western traditions, having his characters talk through the confrontation rather than staring silently. In real life, Brooks said, men facing death often can't stop talking. This realistic approach to tension influenced countless later filmmakers. The Professionals represents the moment when Westerns began questioning their own mythology, using the familiar framework of a standoff to explore deeper questions about loyalty, honor, and the lies that powerful men tell to get others to kill for them. Django, 1966. Franco Nero's mud-soaked final duel with Major Jackson's men is Western brutality distilled to its essence. With broken hands, Django props his pistol on a cemetery cross to deliver vengeance. Director Sergio Corbucci filmed this in the dead of an Italian winter. The mud wasn't fake. It was freezing cold real mud that actors had to lie in for hours. This scene reinvented what a Western hero could endure, showing a protagonist who's barely alive, yet still dangerous. Django doesn't just outdraw his enemies, he outlasts them, surviving torment that would have killed lesser men. The film was so violent it was banned in the UK until 1993. The German censors cut over 13 minutes of footage. Even Italy demanded cuts before release. The ear-cutting scene particularly disturbed censors, who claimed it would inspire copycat violence. Nero's hands were actually injured during filming when a horse-riding stunt went wrong, which Corbucci incorporated into the script by having Django's hands crushed. Nero later recalled, "I was in pain, but Corbucci said, 'Perfect, now you don't need to act.'" The cemetery set was built in 3 days using real tombstones discarded from a nearby graveyard, creating genuine unease among the superstitious Italian crew. Made for approximately $200,000, Django earned over $10 million worldwide and spawned over 30 unofficial sequels using the character's name. Tarantino called it the most violent film ever made up to that time and paid homage with Django Unchained. The image of the coffin-dragging gunslinger has become one of Western cinema's most iconic visuals. The final duel, with Django's mangled hands barely able to operate his gun, created a new template for the Western hero, one who wins through sheer will rather than skill. Corbucci himself later said, "I wanted to destroy the Western myth of the clean-living cowboy. My heroes are filthy, injured, and barely surviving." This approach influenced decades of filmmakers who abandoned the pristine gunslingers of classic westerns for more vulnerable, human characters who bleed, suffer, and still somehow find the strength to pull the trigger when it matters most. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962. John Ford subverted the traditional Western duel by revealing that the legendary confrontation between Jimmy Stewart's Ransom Stoddard and Lee Marvin's Liberty Valance wasn't what it appeared. The famous line, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend," comes from this film's central twist about who really fired the shot. This duel is unique because its power comes not from how it's filmed, but from how it's reframed later, making audiences question everything they thought they knew about heroism in the West. Ford filmed this in black and white when color was standard, saying he wanted it to feel like a memory fading into history. Paramount executives were furious about this decision, believing it would hurt box office potential. The actual duel took only 47 seconds of screen time, but required a full day to shoot. Ford insisted on showing Stoddard trembling and clearly outmatched, breaking with Western tradition of the confident hero. Marvin, who had been a real-life Marine sniper, kept criticizing Stewart's gun handling between takes. Stewart, a decorated World War II bomber pilot, eventually snapped back, "I've killed more men than you ever will, Lee." The tension between the actors perfectly mirrored their characters. The film was Ford's last great Western, grossing $8 million on a $3.2 million budget. Critics initially dismissed it as old-fashioned, but its reputation has grown enormously. Martin Scorsese has called it the saddest film ever made about the West because it's about the death of the frontier and the mythology built on half-truths. The duel itself has become a metaphor for how history gets simplified and rewritten. As film critic Roger Ebert wrote, "This is the first Western that asks, what happens after the West was won?" By deconstructing its central gunfight, revealing that the famous duel didn't happen the way history recorded it, Ford was commenting on his own role in creating the myths of the American West through decades of films. He was, in essence, admitting that the West of movies was a noble fabrication, making this perhaps the most honest Western duel ever filmed. The Big Gundown, 1966. Lee Van Cleef and Thomas Millian's cat-and-mouse game culminates in a subversive final duel where expectations are completely upended. Director Sergio Solima used this Western to smuggle in political commentary about class struggle that censors missed completely. The confrontation isn't just about who's faster on the draw. It's about a lawman realizing he's been working for the real criminals all along. When Cuchillo uses trickery instead of gunplay to defeat the supposedly superior Corbett, it's a metaphor for how the underclass must fight to survive in a system stacked against them. The production ran out of money midway through filming. Solima convinced the actors to defer part of their salaries to finish the movie. The memorable knife versus gun standoff was improvised when a prop gun malfunctioned, forcing Solima to rewrite the scene overnight. Van Cleef and Millian weren't told about the changes until the morning of shooting, creating genuine tension as they worked through the new scenario. The chase through the cane field was filmed with real machetes, resulting in several crew members suffering cuts. Millian, determined to portray authentic Mexican resistance, learned knife-throwing techniques from a circus performer, and insisted on doing his own stunts despite the production's lack of safety protocols. Despite critical acclaim in Europe, American distributors cut 25 minutes from the film, removing crucial political subtext. This butchered version bombed, making only $1.3 million in the US. The complete Italian cut wasn't available in America until 2013. Tarantino has ranked it as his third favorite spaghetti western, calling it the most underappreciated masterpiece of the genre. The final duel, where trickery overcomes traditional gunfighting skill, influenced countless later films, including Robert Rodriguez's Desperado. Solima himself was later blacklisted in Italy for his leftist politics, making this film's success even more remarkable. As film historian Christopher Frayling noted, The Big Gundown succeeds in being both a thrilling action film and a scathing indictment of how law and justice often serve the wealthy rather than the innocent. The duel's subversive outcome, with the lawman outmaneuvered by the peasant fugitive, still resonates as a political statement disguised as Western entertainment. Day of Anger, 1967. Lee Van Cleef's gunfighter, Scott Mary, teaches young Talby the rules of survival, only for the student to eventually face the teacher in a devastating final duel. Director Tonino Valeri, Leone's former assistant, crafted a duel that's as much psychological as physical. The confrontation becomes tragic because both men follow the brutal code they've established throughout the film. When you start killing, you can't stop. Their showdown is inevitable, not because of hatred, but because of the ruthless logic of the West they have both embraced. The production's firearms expert, a former Olympic shooter, taught Giuliano Gemma a quick-draw technique that was actually faster than Van Cleef's. Van Cleef reportedly became irritated when Gemma consistently outdrew him during rehearsals. This real tension between the actors translates perfectly to the characters on screen. The duel was filmed in the Spanish desert in temperatures reaching 110 degrees. The crew created artificial dust clouds that caused respiratory problems for many cast members. Van Cleef wore specially designed contact lenses to give his character a more menacing stare, despite the discomfort they caused in the dusty conditions. Gemma later recalled, "I wasn't acting fear in that final scene. I was genuinely intimidated by Lee. His eyes looked inhuman with those contacts." Shot for approximately $500,000, the film made over $6 million in Europe, but barely received American distribution. Critics recognized its brilliance, though. The legendary French film magazine, Cahiers du Cinéma, called it a perfect distillation of Western mythology into pure ritual. The duel inspired John Woo's gunfights in his Hong Kong action films decades later. Valeri's innovative use of moving cameras during the standoff, when most directors kept the camera static during duels, created a dynamic energy that influenced countless later films. The teacher-student dynamic turned deadly resonated beyond Westerns, inspiring everything from martial arts films to crime dramas. As Van Cleef himself later said, Day of Anger wasn't just about who could shoot faster. It was about what happens when you teach someone all your tricks and then have to face them. That's real drama, not just action. Hang 'em High, 1968. Clint Eastwood's first American Western, after his Italian trilogy, features multiple small duels rather than one showdown, demonstrating how his character, Jed Cooper, methodically hunts down the men who tried to lynch him. Director Ted Post deliberately avoided Leone's style, creating faster, more brutal confrontations. Unlike the operatic buildups of spaghetti westerns, Cooper's vengeance comes suddenly and without warning. This approach created a distinctly American counterpoint to the European style Eastwood had become famous for, proving he could be just as lethal without the musical buildups and extreme close-ups. Eastwood, now a producer as well as star, insisted on realistic gunplay. When Cooper shoots someone, they don't dramatically grab their chest. They just fall down dead. This shocked audiences used to theatrical deaths. Universal executives demanded reshoots to make the violence less abrupt, but Eastwood refused. "People don't get shot and then give speeches," he reportedly told studio heads. "They just die." The film was shot in 32 days, an extremely tight schedule for a Western. Eastwood performed all his own horseback stunts, including a dangerous scene where Cooper is dragged behind a horse. The production used the same noose for the lynching scene that had been used in John Wayne's True Grit, considering it good luck. The gamble paid off. The film cost $1.6 million and grossed over $6.8 million, proving Eastwood's star power transcended the spaghetti westerns that made him famous. Roger Ebert wrote that, "Hang 'em High marks the point where the American Western began to absorb the lessons of its Italian cousins." What makes this film's approach to duels significant is how it strips away romanticism. Cooper isn't seeking showdowns. He's hunting criminals with the cold efficiency of a lawman rather than the flair of a gunslinger. Each confrontation is brief, violent, and devoid of glory. Post later said, "We wanted to show the ugly reality of frontier justice, not the mythology." This realistic approach to Western violence influenced countless later films, including Eastwood's own Unforgiven, which would ultimately deconstruct the genre entirely. Hang 'em High stands as the moment when American Westerns began incorporating the brutality of spaghetti westerns while maintaining their distinctly American sensibility. Death Rides a Horse, 1967. The partnership and eventual confrontation between John Philip Law's Bill and Lee Van Cleef's Ryan features innovative flashback techniques. Bill's traumatic memories appear as red-tinted flashes whenever he recognizes one of the men who murdered his family. The final duel subverts expectations. Instead of fighting each other, these men who've spent the film in an uneasy alliance must stand together against common enemies. This twist on the traditional Western duel shows how revenge can be complicated by unexpected bonds formed along the way. Director Giulio Petroni nearly died filming the final duel when a stunt involving dynamite went wrong. The explosion was much larger than planned and sent debris flying toward the camera crew. Van Cleef reportedly pushed Petroni out of the way of a flying rock, potentially saving his life. The production used real dynamite rather than safer squibs due to budget constraints, making the action sequences genuinely dangerous. Law performed his own riding stunts despite a childhood injury that made horseback riding painful. The red-tinted flashback technique was created by accident when a roll of film was partially exposed to light. Petroni liked the effects so much, he deliberately damaged more film to create the distinctive visual style that would become the film's trademark. The film's intense violence got it banned in Finland and heavily cut in the UK. It still managed to gross approximately $7.5 million worldwide on a $600,000 budget. Quentin Tarantino borrowed heavily from this film for Kill Bill, including the music and the revenge plot structure. Composer Ennio Morricone's score for this film is considered among his most innovative, featuring electric guitars and experimental vocals. The relationship between the veteran gunfighter and his younger counterpart influenced numerous later films, including Unforgiven and The Quick and the Dead. Film scholar Austin Fisher notes, "Death Rides a Horse creates tension not through the traditional question of who will win, but through asking, will these men who should be enemies become true allies?" This subversion of the traditional duel structure, where the expected confrontation between protagonists gives way to them fighting side by side, offered a fresh take on Western revenge narratives. Navajo Joe, 1966. Burt Reynolds' vengeful Native American character dispatches enemies in increasingly creative ways throughout the film, but the final confrontation with the main villain breaks Western duel conventions completely. Director Sergio Corbucci shot this immediately after Django and brought the same brutal sensibility to it. Joe doesn't just outshoot his enemies, he outsmarts them, using his knowledge of the land and indigenous tactics to defeat technologically superior opponents. This approach challenged Western conventions that typically showed Native Americans losing to superior white firepower. Reynolds later called it the worst film ever made, not realizing it had become a cult classic in Europe. He had taken the role after Marlon Brando turned it down. The production was plagued with problems. Reynolds suffered a broken ankle during a stunt and finished the film in severe pain. Reynolds wore dark body makeup for the role that caused skin irritation in the Spanish heat. The makeup would streak when he sweated, requiring constant touch-ups that extended shooting days by hours. Corbucci wanted authentic Native American techniques shown on screen, so he hired a Navajo consultant who taught Reynolds traditional hunting and tracking methods. The famous scene where Joe scalps an opponent used a realistic prosthetic that caused several crew members to become ill during filming. Despite Reynolds' disdain, the film grossed $4.5 million on a $700,000 budget and has been reassessed by critics. Ennio Morricone's soundtrack, under the pseudonym Leo Nichols, has become iconic and was later sampled by Alexandre Desplat for the soundtrack to Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel. The film's portrayal of a Native American protagonist getting revenge on white scalp hunters was groundbreaking for its time, challenging the racist portrayals common in earlier Westerns. As film historian Christopher Frayling noted, Navajo Joe inverted the standard Western formula by making the Indian the hero and the white settlers the savages. The film's influence extended beyond cinema. Several video games, including Red Dead Redemption, have referenced Joe's distinctive fighting style and the visual of a Native American warrior, using the colonizers' own weapons and tactics against them. Massacre Time, 1966. Franco Nero and George Hilton star as brothers who face off against a corrupt family controlling their hometown. The unique bullwhip versus pistol duel between Nero and Nino Castelnuovo remains one of the most unusual weapon matchups in Western history. This confrontation subverts the typical gun duel by introducing an asymmetric element. The whip allows Junior to disarm his opponent from a distance, turning the traditional quick-draw contest into something far more sadistic and prolonged. It's not just about who's faster, it's about who can endure more pain. Director Lucio Fulci, later famous for his horror films, brought a sickening brutality to the violence. The whipping scene was so intense that Italian censors demanded cuts. Nero performed the difficult sequence himself after the stunt double refused, suffering real welts and cuts that are visible on screen. Fulci insisted on showing the actual impact of the whip on bare skin, a level of realism that shocked audiences accustomed to more stylized violence. The scene required 18 takes, with Nero becoming increasingly injured as filming progressed. Castelnuovo practiced with the bullwhip for weeks to achieve the precision needed, still accidentally striking crew members during rehearsals. The distinctive sound of the whip was enhanced in post-production by recording an actual bullwhip being cracked next to a microphone inside a metal bucket, creating the distinctive snap that makes viewers wince. The film cost approximately $300,000 and earned back nearly $3 million, despite limited distribution outside Italy and Germany. Tarantino referenced this film's unusual weapon duel in Django Unchained with the bullwhip scene. Alex Cox, director of Repo Man and Western Scholar, called it the missing link between the classical Western and the ultra-violent exploitation films of the 1970s. Fulci's background in horror cinema influenced his approach to the Western genre. He treated violence as something visceral and disturbing rather than exciting or heroic. This perspective would later influence directors like Robert Rodriguez and S. Craig Zahler, who brought horror sensibilities to their Western films. As Nero later reflected, Massacre Time showed that Western duels didn't need to be clean or fair. Sometimes survival means enduring more punishment than your enemy can inflict. 5-card stud, 1968. Robert Mitchum's mysterious preacher and Dean Martin's card player face off in a duel with a surprising twist ending. Director Henry Hathaway, a veteran of classic westerns, created a darker, more psychological showdown than his earlier work. What makes this duel unique is the moral ambiguity. Mitchum's character uses his position as a man of God to mask his true intentions, and while Martin's character represents the flawed but ultimately more honest gambler. Their confrontation is about more than survival. It's about which code, the hypocritical veneer of righteousness or the gambler's straightforward self-interest, will prevail. The production was troubled by Martin's drinking. For the crucial final confrontation, Martin was reportedly so intoxicated that Hathaway had to use a stand-in for some shots. Mitchum, disgusted, almost walked off the film, but was contractually obligated to finish. Despite these challenges, the tension between the actors translated effectively to screen. Hathaway used an innovative lighting technique for the climactic scene, with harsh shadows creating a visual representation of the moral darkness at play. The production spent nearly a week shooting the final confrontation, using multiple camera setups to capture the psychological cat-and-mouse game between the characters. Mitchum improvised several of his most memorable lines, including the chilling delivery of biblical passages that give the duel its distinctive tone. Despite the behind-the-scenes problems, the film grossed $4.2 million on a $3.5 million budget. Critics were unimpressed, but the duel itself has gained appreciation for its moral ambiguity. Hathaway later said, "We were trying to make a Western for the Vietnam era. There are no heroes, just survivors." The film's exploration of hypocrisy and justice influenced later revisionist Westerns like High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider, where the line between good and evil becomes increasingly blurred. Film critic Andrew Sarris later reassessed the film, writing, "5-Card Stud uses the familiar framework of a Western duel to explore surprisingly modern questions about religious hypocrisy and the nature of justice." The confrontation between Martin's flawed gambler and Mitchum's vengeful preacher remains powerful because it forces viewers to question which man truly represents the greater moral threat. A Minute to Pray, A Second to Die, 1968. The American distributors worried audiences wouldn't understand epilepsy, so they recut the film to make it seem like Clay was simply injured. This butchered version made little sense. Italian audiences saw the complete film, which was praised for its innovation. Actor Alex Cord actually studied epilepsy and consulted with doctors to portray the seizures accurately. The final duel was shot in sequence over 3 days, with Cord deliberately exhausting himself before filming to create the authentic appearance of someone fighting through physical limitations. The crew built special protective padding into the dusty street set to prevent Cord from injuring himself during the seizure scenes. Made for approximately $800,000, the film earned about $2.3 million worldwide. While not a massive hit, it developed a cult following for its unique premise. Film historian Christopher Frayling called it a film that dared to give its gunfighter a realistic vulnerability rather than just a psychological one. The innovative concept influenced later films that gave heroes physical limitations to overcome, from Indiana Jones's fear of snakes to John McClane's bare feet in Die Hard. Giraldi's direction captured both the internal and external battles of a gunfighter whose body could betray him at any moment. The tension comes not just from whether Clay will survive his enemy's bullets, but whether his own nervous system will hold together long enough for him to pull the trigger. This medical element transformed the traditional Western duel into something far more unpredictable and human, showing that even the fastest gunslinger could be undone by factors beyond his control. Guns of the Magnificent Seven, 1969. The third film in the series features a climactic duel between George Kennedy's Chris and Monty Markham's villain, Lobero, that reinvents the confrontation from the original film. Director Paul Wendkos had to work with a significantly smaller budget than the previous films, but created an innovative shootout using mirrors and reflections. This visual trickery wasn't just stylish. It represented how the gunfighter's code had become distorted and corrupted since the original film, with Chris now fighting against a funhouse mirror version of himself. The production was rushed. The entire film was shot in just 39 days in Spain, with the final duel completed in a single day due to budget constraints. Kennedy, replacing Yul Brynner, performed his own stunts in the sequence despite being injured earlier in the shoot. The mirror set was constructed overnight after the original location was damaged in a storm. The crew salvaged mirrors from a shuttered Madrid dance hall, creating the labyrinthine setting that made the duel so distinctive. The broken, fractured reflections created disorienting angles that confused both the characters and the audience about where the real threat was coming from. Kennedy later recalled, "I was genuinely lost in that mirror maze. The confusion you see isn't acting. I honestly couldn't tell which way to point my gun half the time." The film cost $2.5 million, but only grossed $1.5 million in America, though it performed better internationally. While critics dismissed it as an unnecessary sequel, the mirror duel technique influenced numerous later films, including John Woo's Hard Boiled and Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Film theorist Laura Mulvey later wrote about how the sequence deconstructs the masculine gaze typically associated with Western duels by literally fracturing the image of the gunfighter. The mirror shootout remains the film's most memorable contribution to cinema, proving that even a modestly budgeted sequel could innovate within the constraints of a franchise. What seemed like a gimmick at the time has been recognized as a powerful visual metaphor for the fractured identity of the aging Western hero, forced to confront distorted reflections of his own mythology. Ride the High Country, 1962. The final shootout between Joel McCrea's Steve Judd and a gang of criminals happens while his friend Gil, played by Randolph Scott, is pinned down by gunfire. Director Sam Peckinpah's breakthrough film showed his early genius for choreographing violence. This wasn't just any duel, it was the last stand of aging lawmen whose code of honor had become obsolete in a changing West. Judd's final walk toward his enemies, wounded but unbowed, established the template for the dignified death that would become a Peckinpah trademark. This was the final film for both McCrea and Scott, two legends of the genre. They came out of retirement specifically for this movie, sensing it would be special. The climactic gunfight was filmed in the Sierra Nevada mountains in freezing conditions. McCrea later revealed he suffered frostbite during the 3-day shoot. Peckinpah insisted on filming during magic hour, the brief period at dusk when the light takes on a golden quality, requiring the entire crew to wait hours for just minutes of filming time each day. The famous line, "All I want is to enter my house justified," was added by McCrea himself, drawing from his religious background to give his character's death additional weight. Made for just $800,000, the film barely broke even at the box office, but received extraordinary critical acclaim. It's now considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. Peckinpah used this film as a testing ground for the revolutionary techniques he would perfect in The Wild Bunch 7 years later. The final duel's emphasis on the physical cost of violence, showing Judd struggling forward despite his wounds, broke with Hollywood tradition of clean, painless deaths. As film critic Michael Srago noted, Ride the High Country uses its climactic gunfight not just as an action set piece, but as a profound statement about aging, dignity, and moral choice. This duel wasn't just about who lived or died. It was about how a man chooses to face his end, establishing the elegiac tone that would define the best westerns of the late 1960s and 1970s. Face to Face, 1967. Gian Maria Volonté's transformation from meek professor to ruthless outlaw culminates in a psychological duel with Thomas Milian that subverts every Western trope. Director Sergio Solima created a politically charged showdown about the corruption of power. This confrontation isn't resolved with bullets, but with moral choices, challenging the genre's traditional emphasis on physical prowess and quick draws. When the professor becomes more brutal than the bandits he initially feared, the film forces viewers to question how civilization and savagery might be closer than they appear. Volonté prepared for the role by studying psychological case studies of how ordinary men become violent when given authority. He lost 20 pounds to appear physically weaker at the beginning of the film, then regained it during production to visually represent his character's transformation. The production was nearly shut down when Italian authorities became concerned about its political message during a time of social unrest in Italy. Solima had to convince censors it was just a Western, while smuggling in commentary about fascism and revolution. The The final confrontation was filmed in an abandoned Spanish village that the crew modified to resemble a ghost town, a physical representation of the moral emptiness at the heart of the story. The film cost approximately $600,000 and earned over $4 million in Europe, but American distributors cut 15 minutes and changed the ending, destroying its impact. This butchered version flopped in the US. Film critic Tony Raines called the original cut the most politically sophisticated Western ever made. Salama's background in political activism informed the film's exploration of how violence corrupts even those with the best intentions. The duel's resolution, where intellectual reasoning proves more decisive than gunplay, challenged genre conventions while commenting on contemporary political realities. As Valance later explained, this wasn't just about cowboys and Indians. We were making a film about how power transforms people, using the Western as camouflage. The Shooting, 1966. Jack Nicholson and Warren Oates' mysterious journey through the desert ends with one of cinema's most ambiguous and existential duels. Director Monty Hellman created an art house Western that completely rejected genre conventions. The final confrontation isn't about justice or revenge, but something far more abstract, an almost metaphysical reckoning that suggests these characters might be different aspects of the same person. The sparse dialogue and disorienting camera work leave viewers questioning whether what they're seeing is real or symbolic. The film was shot back-to-back with Ride in the Whirlwind in Utah for approximately $75,000 total, about $37,500 per film. The entire crew consisted of 13 people. For the climactic confrontation, Hellman used extreme telephoto lenses to create a disorienting effect where distance becomes impossible to judge. The actors appear close together and then suddenly far apart. This technique wasn't just stylistic. It represented the film's theme of reality becoming increasingly unstable. Nicholson, not yet a star, worked for scale and also served as producer. Oates reportedly didn't fully understand the script, but trusted Hellman's vision. The final scene required 23 takes, with Hellman refusing to explain to the actors exactly what was happening, preferring their genuine confusion to inform their performances. The film barely received theatrical distribution in America, but became a sensation at European film festivals. It lost money initially, but has become hugely influential. Celebrated critic Jonathan Rosenbaum called it the Western that killed the Western, because it so thoroughly deconstructed the genre's myths that traditional examples seem naive afterward. Directors like Terrence Malick and Jim Jarmusch have cited The Shooting as a major influence on their work. The film's duel represents perhaps the ultimate subversion of Western conventions, a confrontation where nothing is explained, resolution is denied, and the audience is left to determine what, if anything, has actually been resolved. As Hellman himself later stated, "I wasn't interested in making a Western. I was using Western tropes to explore existential questions about identity and reality." Which standoff hit you hardest? Was it the operatic grandeur of Once Upon a Time in the West, or the brutal efficiency of Django? The psychological complexity of Face to Face, or the existential mystery of The Shooting? Drop your pick in the comments. The question isn't whether these techniques survived, but whether modern filmmakers will ever match the raw power these directors achieved with a fraction of today's budgets.